Just as the friar had his supporters, he also had his detractors. Those who opposed Savonarola were called the arrabbiati, which means literally the angered or the angry ones, and they included powerful men. Savonarola's arguably most powerful enemy was the Pope himself, Alexander VI. Savonarola frequently called out this Borgia Pope as the very epitome of church corruption, vice, and sacrilege. The Pope, understandably not happy with these kinds of sermons, ordered Savonarola to quit preaching, and when this didn't work, he put pressure on Florentine bankers, threatening their investments. And as you might imagine, this was far more effective in convincing leading Florentines to turn away from Savonarola. In 1497, he was excommunicated. And meanwhile, various groups of Florentines were getting fed up with his religious regime. Other religious orders, too, had had enough. The Franciscans, for example, were sick of seeing the donations that they normally received go to Savonarola's Dominican order instead. So what happens is that a Franciscan actually challenges Savonarola to prove that he's God's prophet with a trial by fire. So everything is set up, they built this elaborate contraption, he has to walk through fire. Actually, one of his underlings offers to take his place. But, lucky for Savonarola, or really for his follower, the actual ordeal was rained out. But the tide had turned. Mobs of Florentines attacked Savonarolan followers. The friar himself was seized by the Signoria, tortured, and forced to confess that he had lied about it all, that he was a false prophet. He and two of his closest followers were hung in the Piazza della Signoria. Their bodies were burned and their ashes were tossed into the Arno River. So now what? With Savonarola gone, the leading wealthy men of Florence, the Ottimati, proposed to institute a smaller council of 150 to 200 elite Florentines to rule the city. This would effectively make Florence once again a more straightforward plutocracy. Between 1498 and 1502, so for 4 years, they fought continuously with the Great Council, which, the Great Council leaned more towards the needs and demands of the middling classes, and they fought continuously over finances, foreign policy, and social agendas. Florence lost a military campaign against Pisa, and in 1501, Tuscany was invaded by Cesare Borgia, who was the son of Pope Alexander. So he took Piombino in the south, and then Arezzo in the southeast was seized by Borgia allied forces. So it's not a great moment to be a lawmaker in Florence. And it's at this time, too, that two figures emerge that will be of great importance to Florentine politics and the history of Florence. The first is Piero Soderini, who becomes the Florentine ambassador to the French court, where he treated with the new King Louis XII to support Florence against the Borgias. The second is Niccolò Machiavelli, who traveled with Piero's brother Francesco to Rome to negotiate with the Borgias directly. Piero Soderini came to power during a moment of profound struggle between the Ottimati and the rest of the council. He was actually one of the 12 of these powerful Ottimati citizens who wished to arrogate more power to an oligarchy of wealthy individuals. Of course, there's always continual pushback from the council on this. So what they eventually ended up doing was conducting a kind of referendum. Committees of 10 members from each of the 4 main quarters of Florence submitted recommendations for city government. And what they finally settled on was the establishment of a smaller council of between 180 to 300 members that could govern independently of the Great Council when it came to fiscal matters. So this smaller council would have a tenure of 3 to 5 years. Still, even a council of 200 to 300 members was going to have difficulty getting anything done. And then the Great Council refused to vote into being this new, smaller council because effectively, divide up power. So in this moment, when you have this back and forth and it's indecision and cyclical debate, really what Florence needed was a leader. And Florentines kind of begin to point to the example of Venice, where the Doge, the ruler of Florence, sat in his position for life, governing alongside the Venetian Senate. So the men who wanted a smaller council changed tactics. Instead of this council, they proposed that the Gonfaloniere della Giustizia, a man who is normally chosen from among the Signoria, rule as Gonfaloniere for life. Now, after initially rejecting this proposal, the council approved it with the stipulation that they could nominate and elect this leader. Now, the Ottimati obviously would have preferred to propose one of their own men, but they nevertheless had to agree to the council's proposal, seeking to influence the voting as best they could. So in the fall of 1502, no less than 2,000 council members gathered in the hall. Now, initially, they nominated 236 candidates. There were successive rounds of elections. This was whittled down to 3 candidates and finally to one, Piero Soderini. Now, why Piero Soderini? Well, he was an appealing choice because, quite frankly, he simply wasn't in Florence when all that business was going down with Savonarola and the Medici. He had spent many years abroad as an ambassador to the French court, so he seemed to be kind of a political outsider, if you will. The council didn't have to worry about him being allied with the Fratteschi, the supporters of Savonarola. Even if Savonarola was at this point long dead, he still had a large following. Or the Medici, who were sort of waiting off in the wings for the right moment to take over. Moreover, Soderini was an appealing choice to the Ottimati because he was kind of part of their clique. So they knew that he would certainly have their interests, or at least they assumed that he would have their interests in mind. Soderini proved to be a capable politician. He was able to hold on to power in Florence for a good 10 years. And he could do this largely because the foreign powers that had been rampaging through Tuscany were, at least at the start of Soderini's rule, occupied momentarily elsewhere. He was able to maintain cordial relations with the French, and he also instituted a few of reforms inspired by Savonarola. This included new sumptuary laws and limits on dowries. So this sort of pleased the common people, or certainly pleased the Fratteschi. And then he entered into a protracted, long, drawn-out military conquest, warfare with Pisa that ended with the capture of the city after a devastating siege in 1509. It was also during this period, during Soderini's rule, that Michelangelo's David, which was originally supposed to go on the Duomo, was placed in the Piazza della Signoria, just in front of the platform where the city leaders would give speeches to the people gathered in the square. Now, the David itself became a symbol of Florence, the chosen city that battled against giant threats, whether in the form of foreign powers or Medici despotism. It's during this period that our other protagonist, Niccolo Machiavelli, enjoyed his greatest successes. After working with Piero's brother at the Borgia papal court as a secretary, Machiavelli made a name for himself arguing for the establishment of a local militia headed by a local leader, rather than hiring a condottiere, a military captain from outside Florence. After Florentine forces, led by condottieri, that is, military leaders who were not from Florence, failed to take Pisa, Soderini decided to let Machiavelli try his hand at military leadership. Accordingly, Machiavelli recruited men from the countryside and beefed up his battalions to almost 5,000 men. This made the elites more than a little nervous. Machiavelli had, after all, armed peasants, from the countryside, and the nobles, anyways, could see where that might pose a problem. But in the end, Pisa fell after a long siege, as I mentioned, and Soderini and Florence just basked in the victory. So Soderini seemed to have achieved a political equilibrium in Florence, ruling alongside and in cooperation with various councils and committees that now made up the Florentine government. He had had success on the battlefield, created political stability, that was translating then into economic prosperity for Florence. So why, by 1512, did he have to flee for his life into exile? How had it all gone so wrong so quickly? Well, we'll read more about that for next week, but the short answer is that he got on the wrong side of the Pope. Pope Julius II was determined to drive the French out of Italy. But Soderini refused to break Florence's alliance with France. So Louis XII was now on the French throne, and he had really enraged the Pope by seeking to deliberately oust him from power, and very visibly so. In 1511, Julius put together his best allies, creating the Holy League, and went off campaigning to kick Louis out of Italy. So Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, as we remember, he's the brother of the ousted Piero the Unfortunate, was working for the Pope at this time and also scheming his way back into power in Florence. There are massive battles that take place between the French army and the Holy League, in which first the French were victorious, but then the Papal League slowly, inexorably, takes back the lands that had been conquered by the French. So faced with ignominious defeat, Louis pulls up his stakes and he takes his armies back over the Alps. At this point, Soderini is in big trouble. He's abandoned by the Florentines, and he flees across the Adriatic Sea to Ragusa, and he leaves the way open for Giovanni de' Medici to essentially waltz back into the city unopposed. So after the Medici take control, former staffers of the Soderini regime are exiled, and in certain instances, as was the case for Machiavelli, they were also tortured for information and imprisoned. Machiavelli was then exiled from Florence. He was banished to his home in the countryside near San Casciano. It was there that he wrote The Prince, which you'll be reading this week. So the traditional way to interpret The Prince has been to see it as a sort of job application. In this interpretation, Machiavelli writes The Prince as an advice manual and a way to sort of prove his worthiness to the reinstated Medici regime. So he writes it to help get himself back into politics, to help himself get a job. But another interpretation, the way other historians have seen it, is really as a piece of satire. So it's aimed to subtly, or really not so subtly, mock the Medici. We should keep in mind that Machiavelli was a staunch Republican, and in his long experience as a diplomat and courtier and a military man, he had much experience dealing with military and political leaders. So what do you think? My question for this week is, how do you read The Prince? Do you think it's a piece of satire? Does it seem to you more like a job application? Or do you have a different interpretation? So we'll be answering this and other questions together as we weigh in on the discussion forum. And next week, we'll see what happens with the new Medici regime as the first Medici Pope takes power and the Protestant Revolution sweeps through the continent.